When I put out my original Wolf Among Us theory, I expected debate, disagreement, maybe a few people saying, interesting take, but you're wrong. And I did get that. What I didn't expect was how comments started clustering around a few specific pressure points. So, yeah, let's talk about that. First, a quick rewind. That video wasn't about declaring one definitive answer. It wasn't a lore dump, and it definitely wasn't me pretending Telltale secretly slipped a PowerPoint explanation into the game files and forgot to tell everyone. What I was doing was this. I took the game at its word. I treated The Wolf Among Us the way it asks to be treated, like a story built on roles, patterns, curses, mirrors, and old fairy tales that refuse to stay buried. Instead of asking, what do the writers say happens, I asked, what does the game itself consistently show us? That meant looking at dialogue echoes, watching how magic behaves, paying attention to who the magic mirror shows and doesn't, and yes, comparing characters to their original fairy tale roles, because this universe literally tells us that those stories still matter. That approach led me to a few uncomfortable conclusions, one of them being that the dead troll might not be who we're told she is, another being that the woman who walks away at the end is probably not Nerissa, and eventually that Snow White herself might be the most carefully hidden character in the entire game, which is where the comments understandably caught fire. Some zeroed in on Lily and Holly, especially the tattoos, because emotionally, it feels better to believe they honored each other, that those markings are grief, not evidence, and I get that. It's a kinder interpretation. Others couldn't see the Snow as Nerissa angle at all, especially if you take Snow's surface role at face value and never question it again. Some pointed to the comics as a hard stop, which raises a bigger question about whether we're analyzing this story or importing answers from a different one. And then there's the dwarf argument, which apparently for some people was the moment the theory crossed from interesting into, you've lost the plot, sir. So here's what I'm gonna do. Instead of talking past those comments, I'm gonna walk straight into them. I'll take each idea on its own terms. No straw men, no dismissals, no brushing it off saying, you just didn't get it. I'll look at the Lily-Holly swap and why people resist it, how the Snow is Nerissa idea actually formed step by step, whether the comics help, hurt, or simply tell a different story, and yes, the dwarves, why they matter and why mentioning them doesn't magically invalidate everything else. Not to win an argument, but to see where each path actually leads, and whether the story holds together when you follow its rules all the way to the end, because in The Wolf Among Us, truth doesn't usually announce itself. It hides behind roles, it wears familiar faces, and sometimes it survives by letting everyone believe it's already been found. So let's dig back in. Alright, let's get this one out of the way early. The comics. Because the moment you start talking theory with The Wolf Among Us, someone will inevitably parachute into the comments, cool. Pause. Here's the honest part. I'm not an encyclopedia of the Fables comic series. I'm not pretending to be. I know this story is a kind of prequel to the Fables series, but no, I didn't sit down with a red string wall and a bunch of trade paperbacks before making that video. But here's the thing. I didn't need to, because I'm sure one thing is absolutely consistent across both iterations of this story. Ironically, I'm pretty sure it's the most single important tool in any illusionist's bag of tricks. Misdirection. It's everywhere in the game, it's baked into the mechanics. It's literally enforced by magic. People lie, magic lies better, and authority figures are wrong, confidently. So when someone says, the comics make it clear, my only real question is, clear to who? Because clarity in this universe is usually a trap. Now the big comic-related mic drop I've seen goes something like this. At the end, after Nerissa walks away, the Crooked Man grabs her and says, I have faith. Okay, that's blunt, I'll give you that. But I repeat, clarity in this universe is usually a trap. So let's slow down for half a second and ask a question the wolf among us loves to steer us away from. Does that actually prove anything? Because all it really proves is this: the crooked man believes he has faith. That's it. And this is the same crooked man who thought he had total control over Georgie, thought his leverage over everybody was airtight, thought he was 10 steps ahead, right up until he very much wasn't. He's not omniscient, he's no saint. He's a crime boss with confidence and blind spots, which historically is a terrible combination. So if he says, "I have faith," that doesn't automatically mean he understands every glamour in play, or that nothing was happening behind his back, or that he knows where faith is. It just means he thinks he does. And in a story built entirely on hidden identities, layered disguises, and people surviving by being underestimated, belief is not the same thing as truth. Now, am I saying the comics are wrong? No. What I'm saying is that linear confirmation doesn't erase interpretive ambiguity, especially in a franchise where the writers are very, very good at weaponizing assumptions. These are the same writers who made a murder mystery where we question if the girl walking away at the end is actually the dead girl from the beginning. The same writers who built magic rules that contradict themselves just enough to stay plausible. And the same writers who ended the game with a single repeated sentence that detonated over 10 years of debate. They understand misdirection. They rely on it. So when the comics offer a cleaner, more straightforward explanation, that doesn't automatically invalidate alternate readings of the game. It just means the comics went down one path. And that's fine, but it doesn't mean every other path suddenly disappears. Because The Wolf Among Us isn't a story about answers, it's a story about who controls the narrative. And if the last words come from a character literally called the Crooked Man, I think it's fair to at least ask, is this truth, or is this just another confident lie spoken by someone who never realized his game was already slipping out of his hands? I'm not saying my interpretation is right, I'm just saying it's not automatically wrong just because the most corrupt guy in the story says otherwise. Alright, let's talk about Lily and Holly, because this one got people going. And to be clear up front, I'm not emotionally married to the idea that they swapped identities. This is just one of those theories that exists in the uncomfortable middle space of possible, not proven. But the pushback itself is worth unpacking. The most common counter-argument is actually a pretty human one. Those tattoos are tributes. They honored each other. And honestly, yeah, that works. On an emotional level, it makes a lot of sense. Lily has a holly tattoo. Holly has a lilac tattoo. Two sisters marking each other permanently. That tracks. That's grief logic. That's love. End of story. But then we hit the part that makes me tilt my head slightly and go, okay, but what about that? The butterfly. Holly has a trailing purple butterfly tattoo across her chest. Not holly or anything green and red, nothing representing her own name, a lilac-colored butterfly. Now, butterflies aren't random. They're usually shorthand for change, transition. They show up in spring after the transition from winter. Also, metamorphosis. They start as caterpillars, and then boom, butterfly, becoming something else, which is an interesting choice for a character whose entire existence in Fabletown hinges on pretending to be something she's not. Human. And the fact that it's purple makes me very curious. Does that mean anything? Maybe, maybe not. And that's the problem. Nothing in this game ever just sits still and explains itself. Then there's the second big criticism. They don't even look the same. And that's true. Lily's skin is dark gray or purple. Holly's more red, almost human-toned if that human was sunburnt. And yeah, that's a real difference. But here's the thing. we never see Lily alive. The only time we see her in troll form when she's already dead. And dead skin does weird things. Discoloration, draining, bruising, lighting changes, especially in a Nora game that loves shadows and cold slabs. So could that color difference be meaningful? Absolutely. Could it also be explained by post-mortem changes, lighting, or just art direction? Also, yes, which means it doesn't actually settle the argument either way. Now, let's zoom out a bit. I'd like to present an idea. Lily and Holly are trolls, non-human fables, living in a city that forces them to wear glamours just to exist without being shipped off to the farm. If you're a pair of trolls who might look very similar in your natural form, and you're constantly switching between glamoured and unglamoured states, identity matters. Recognition matters. And in that context, tattoos could go from being a form of personal expression to something more like identifiers. Marks that say, "This is me, not her, me." That doesn't mean the swap definitely happened, but it does mean the tattoos don't automatically disprove it either. They could be tributes, they could be IDs. They could be both somehow, I don't know. But just like everything else in this story, the game refuses to lock it down. So where does that leave us? Right where the wolf among us seems to want us. Lily's skin is darker, maybe that's who she was. Holly's skin is redder, maybe that's who she always was. Or maybe they switched, maybe they didn't. There's no line of dialogue that settles it, no neat bow, no magic mirror confirmation. Well, unless you believe the magic mirror can't be fooled. That's something I haven't been able to prove. It shows us Holly, yes, but interestingly, she's in human form, meaning she has an active glamour on. If you ask to see Lily, it won't. Not because she's dead, the mirror can show us dead people. It definitely has something to do with the ribbon curse, but the part that breaks my brain is the fact that a Snow White disguise doesn't wear a ribbon, so she couldn't have looked like Snow when she died. And my thoughts trail on. Anyways, that's another case of overlapping details that could mean something, or could be grief, coincidence, and survival tangled together, specifically designed to make things possible without proving anything. And honestly, that's kind of the point. This game doesn't give you clean truths, it gives you pieces, and then it waits to see what you do with them. So if your takeaway is they didn't swap, the tattoos are memorials, fair. If your takeaway is there's something off here and I don't trust it, also fair. Because in Fabletown, even the dead don't always stay who you think they are. Alright, this is the big one. The part where people might lean forward and the rest slowly back away. Nerissa at the end might actually be Snow. So, let me explain how I even got there, because this really wasn't a rage bait idea. It was my own slow realization that came from following the game's logic a little too faithfully. First, the pattern. One thing The Wolf Among Us does extremely well is let its characters play distorted versions of their roles. Not exact retellings, evolutions. Crane is still the obsessive man whose fixation destroys him. The crooked man is, well, yeah. Georgie Porgy lives up to the rhyme in the ugliest possible way. Bloody Mary takes the mirror myth and makes it literal. Not reflection as metaphor, but reflection as violence. She doesn't reveal truth gently, she rips it out of you. Even Bigby and Woody are caught in that same gravity. The wolf and the woodsman, both bouncing between monster and protector, never fully escaping either role. So once I noticed that pattern, it was hard to stop seeing it. Then I got to Lily and Holly. They don't have clean fairy tales attached to them, but their names still carry weight. Flowers, growth, death, survival, memory. Whether they swapped or not, the symbolism is there, and that's when something clicked for me because, once I entertained the possibility that Lily and Holly weren't what they seemed, I had to look back at who told us who's who. And Snow flat out tells us that the dead troll is Lily. Shockingly, certainly, she knows. What did I say before? Clarity in this universe is usually a trap. So now, I'm paying closer attention to Snow, and suddenly, I realize Snow doesn't feel like Snow White at all. Not the Snow White we recognize, not even close, which sent me back to her stories. Snow White and the Dwarves, a girl ordered to die who escapes into the woods, survives by hiding, and lives under protection that isn't nearly as wholesome as the Mundy version pretends. Snow White and Rose Red, two halves of a whole, one softer, one sharper, balanced through duality. And Rose Red is somewhere in this universe, just not really existent in this story. But by this point, I already felt like Nerissa wasn't the Little Mermaid. She doesn't fit. The longing, the sacrifice, the voice for Leg's tragedy that ends in erasure. It's not really there. If anything, Nerissa does feel closer to Donkey Skin, Faith's story. A woman hiding inside another identity, surviving through disguise, waiting for the right moment to be seen. So, okay. In Nerissa, we can see Faith's story, at least partially, and then there's Snow, who really doesn't feel like she's living hers. So what if she isn't? Alright, let's talk about the Dwarves, because this is where some decided the theory took my credibility, drove off a cliff, and exploded. The argument goes like this. The Dwarves in this universe were sinister. Snow wouldn't have considered them her friends. Therefore, I guess everything else collapses? I mean, yeah, that's a fair reaction. The game barely touches this piece of lore, but when it does, it's not exactly painting the Dwarves as 7 cheerful roommates who whistle while they work.
Dwarves. Less said about that, the better.
They're darker, they're dangerous, and whatever version of Snow's past exists in this universe, it's not the sanitized bedtime story. So let's try to separate what's being argued from what's actually required for the theory to work. First, context. The line in question is Nerissa in Bigby's office talking about being lost.
Sometimes we have to find our way through life on our own, grasping and fumbling in the dark. I used to have friends to help me find my way, but now they're gone.
When I framed that monologue through Snow, for me, it clicked. Emotionally, narratively, and thematically. Snow White does have a past that fits that language, and yes, I implied the friends she was talking about could be the Dwarves, but that's where the alarms went off, because in this universe, the Dwarves weren't kind. They weren't innocent. They weren't exactly friend material. Okay, all true. Now, when we're rummaging through the scene of the crime, Bigby does point out that the fairy tale version of Snow White, the soft, innocent glass coffin one, is the Mundy version of her story.
What is that?
It's a book about Snow White, or about the Mundy version of her story anyway.
Meaning that version still exists. It's still circulating. It's still how another part of the world thinks Snow White's story went, which is interesting. Might not mean anything, but regardless, for me, the question isn't, were the Dwarves actually good people? The question is, what did Snow believe at the time? Put yourself in her position. She's ordered to be killed. She runs. She's alone. She's literally stumbling through the woods with no protection, no power, and no allies. Then she meets them. Are they dangerous? Probably. Do they have darker motives? Almost certainly. But they give her something she doesn't have anymore. A place to stay. A chance to live. A break from running. And when you've just been forced to let go of everything in your life, that can feel an awful lot like friendship. At least at first. hope doesn't require purity. In Snow's case, it just requires an alternative to dying alone. So even if the dwarves eventually turned out to be unsavory, that doesn't erase what they represented to her in that moment. They were the difference between survival and oblivion, and that matters. Now, does this require a bit of narrative reach? Sure. Heck, maybe the friends weren't the dwarves at all. Maybe they were just the forest critters. Now, aside from figuring out who this girl's friends were, here's why I think Nerissa's office scene is such a big clue. It's why that line exists at all. Remember, this isn't a history lesson. This isn't just chit-chat or gossip. It's a murder mystery. Every line of dialogue is intentional. Every word is doing work. Someone sat in a room and decided this sentence, this phrasing, was worth keeping. So now, the real question is, who would naturally think to say this? Let's try Nerissa first. If she's speaking as the Little Mermaid, there's a problem. Anderson's version doesn't have Flounder or Sebastian or a quirky found family. She had sisters, and they mattered. Deeply. And I seriously doubt she would describe them as friends. That's not how that story works. Okay, what about Faith? Donkey Skin didn't have friends either. She had one ally who helped her escape. Then she lived in isolation. It's not a story about companionship. It's about endurance. So again, the word friends doesn't quite land. Which leaves us with Snow. Snow White is the one whose story does involve companionship in the abstract. Beings who helped her survive, who guided her, who gave her structure when she was lost. However warped that version became in this universe. And here's the clever part. The line is vague enough to not trigger the ribbon curse. It doesn't reveal names, it doesn't expose a crime, it doesn't identify her. Anyone could say it, but from the options that we have, only one person would think to say it that way. That's the difference. The other girls could have used that line and been technically safe since it would have been a lie, an empty one at that. Snow wouldn't be lying, she'd be speaking sideways about a past that belongs to her, while hiding it behind language broad enough to pass as anyone's. And that's the trick. She's not telling Bigby who she is, she's letting the audience, and maybe Bigby, do the work. That's how this story operates. Truth isn't stated. It's implied, disguised, left hanging just long enough for you to feel it before you can name it. So Nerissa might be Snow. Okay, why would she do this? Well, one question I kept finding myself coming back to was, what if Snow got mixed up with the girls intentionally or not? Now, hold your comment. I will come back to this. But we know the Crooked Man wanted someone dead. What if that someone was Snow? Or someone Snow was disguised as? Or maybe someone disguised as Snow who was convinced or otherwise thought it would be safer to then disguise themselves as Faith. You can really go down the rabbit hole here. Either way, a hit goes out, someone dodges it, and suddenly Snow White, the most visible woman in Fabletown, needs to disappear. Fast. So where do you hide in a city ruled by glamours? You hide in someone no one looks at too closely. Nerissa. Quiet, marginalized, cursed into silence, invisible by design. And once you see that possibility, the rest of Nerissa's behavior stops feeling random. Because from that point on, she's not confessing, she's hinting. She can't say who she is, the ribbon won't allow it, so she does the only thing left. She speaks sideways. She mirrors Faith's words. She circles topics instead of naming them. She gives Bigby fragments, pauses, unfinished thoughts. Not enough to break the curse, just enough to be recognized if someone's paying attention. And suddenly, that office scene hits different, talking about stumbling in the dark, about losing friends, about having no one left to guide her. If those words come from Snow, they land, because if she is hiding as Nerissa, Snow has again been forced to lose everything. The forest, the dwarves, or a path to survival, Prince Charming, the simplicity of who she was. And if it is true, she's even lost Bigby, the one who saved her from imprisonment. And now she's navigating the politics, corruption, and violence of Fabletown wearing a mask that lets her survive, but never speak freely. So no, I'm not saying this is definitely the answer, but once you follow the pattern the game itself establishes, characters bending their original roles instead of abandoning them, the idea that Snow might be hiding in plain sight stops sounding outrageous. It starts sounding deliberate, and Bigby's closest ally disappearing without anyone noticing might be the most Fabletown move of all. Alright, I'm gonna start winding this down and working towards closing this out. Where does all of this actually leave us? If Snow is Nerissa, then the obvious next question is, where does that leave the real Nerissa in Faith? And don't worry, I'm still working toward the idea of Snow getting involved with the pudding and pie. Just hold on. Let's start with Nerissa, because I don't actually think she vanished. I'm fairly confident Nerissa is Vivian. And no, that's not just because it's neat and symmetrical, it's because Vivian is the only one who gives us an origin story for the pudding and pie that actually matters.
How could you do this? I thought you cared about them.
I do. Of course I do. You have to understand, nobody was supposed to die. When we built this place, it was just a stupid idea, a gimmick. Discretion is our guarantee. That's how it started anyway. This was supposed to be our place. We were going to be in charge for once, and nobody would try to control us or use us. That was the point.
She tells us she and Georgie built it together from scratch. A place with a very specific gimmick. Guaranteed discretion, enforced by magic, ribbons that silence, secrets that stay buried. But remember, she's wearing a ribbon when she tells us this. Meaning, whatever version of that story we got, it wasn't the full truth. Now pile that on top of something the game never really calls attention to, but absolutely wants you to notice. Out of all the girls that work there, the pudding and pie only honors one. Not Donkey Skin, not trolls, just the mermaid. There's a framed mermaid painting, and a massive neon mermaid sign. Can't miss that one. And suddenly, that fairy tale stops feeling decorative, because The Little Mermaid isn't a love story, it's a curse story. A girl trades her voice for legs, but more importantly, the possibility of escape. She walks in pain, she's silenced by design, and in the end, the deal doesn't save her. That maps disturbingly well onto a club built around magical silence, enforced consent, and the illusion of safety. Vivian pulls her ribbon herself. That's not rebellion, that's resignation. And that ending? That's not Disney. That's Anderson. Which means Vivian's story ends exactly the way The Little Mermaid's does. Not rescued, not redeemed, just gone. Reduced to something else. So, if Vivian is Nerissa's true origin, the woman who built the cage, then that part of the puzzle actually locks into place pretty cleanly. Now Faith, if Snow is Nerissa, then Faith only has two real options. Either she's dead or she's Snow. And yeah, that's the part that even made me sit back and stare at the ceiling for a bit. Because there are things that point that way. The family ring pulled from Faith's head, it ends up in the business office. The donkey skin cloak, pulled from Toad's chimney, also ends up in the business office, which just so happens to be exactly where Faith would want those things to be if she was disguised as Snow. Her identity, her history, her escape tools, all quietly reclaimed while we completely forgot about them. And now we hit the part that maybe you've been waiting for me to come back to. It's also something nobody really talks about. The actual catalyst for everything. Even I hate looking at it. But come on, we have to talk about it. The photo. Crane, Snow, that sick fantasy. Ask yourself something very simple. How was that photo taken? Do you really think someone stood in the room with a camera while Crane was living out Snow's nightmares? Because that's laughable. The only thing that makes sense is that it was taken through the magic mirror. And where's the magic mirror? The business office. Who has access to it? Well, Crane, but he couldn't see himself while that was happening. Who else do we know of? Bigby, Bluebeard, and Snow. So imagine that for a second. Imagine Snow sees it, like one day or night, she needed to figure out what Crane was up to for whatever reason, and this is what she got. What are her options? Go back to work the next day and pretend nothing happened? Report it knowing exactly how power works in Fabletown? Confront the man who clearly sees her as an object? Or disappear? Change the board? Move off the map? Step into the margins where power doesn't look and let someone else take your place? And if she does that, if Snow gets involved with the girls, the club, the ribbons, the secrecy, not as a victim, but as someone trying to control the fallout, suddenly the entire murder mystery looks different. Not random, not sloppy, reactive, desperate. And now, the last scene of the game, Nerissa walks away. Whoever she really is, she's done running. She's done confessing. She's done worrying. She's waiting. Because I almost forgot, glamours don't last forever. Eventually, the spell fades, the mask drops, and whoever's underneath has to face the world again, as themselves, or whoever they've become. So where does that leave us? With no clean answers, no confession, no single truth. Just a story that ends not with a reveal, but with a question. When the glamour finally breaks, who's left standing? Anyways, comment below your thoughts, opinions, or even other videos that add to the discussion. Before I end this, I want to say this clearly. Thank you to the creators of The Wolf Among Us. Every single one of you. Not for answers, clearly not for answers, but for crafting a murder mystery so deliberately layered, so carefully misdirected that over a decade later we're still arguing about who was who died, and who walked away wearing someone else's face. It's an unfinished story, yes. It's a murder mystery, after all, and it's a successful one. Now, I've seen people get seriously pissed off that the sequel isn't out yet. Delay after delay. Me, honestly, I don't give a shit about the status of The Wolf Among Us 2. Not because I don't want it, I really do, but because topping this would require an absurd level of confidence and restraint. The kind of storytelling where ambiguity isn't a mistake, it's the point. Where silence is more powerful than exposition. Where the final scene doesn't explain anything. It just waits. So take your time, as much as you need. When it happens, if it happens, count me in. Because if lightning ever strikes twice, it won't be by rushing. It'll be by trusting the audience to sit with uncertainty. Just like the audience for this game continues to do over a decade later. The scariest part isn't that we don't know the truth. It's that we might have already heard its whispers and still let them walk away. Thanks for watching.